I have to admit, I love animations in PowerPoint. Love, love, love animations in PowerPoint. To the point where I decided I had to put some in this presentation. So I'm going to get them out of my system in the first couple of slides for your and my sake. So assuming that I press this button correctly, things should move. The first rule of creating a new conference is never to call it the first annual, because then you'll never have another one. So, again, getting it out of our system, right? I also like to use black and white because Jonathan's black and I'm white.
Fellow African.
It's not racist if it's factual.
Even better, you're Canadian, I'm American.
Exactly. So, anyway. Welcome to the Companero Conference. And my name is Randolph West. I'm going to change my accent 6 times in this presentation, only because I don't know what my real accent is. Take me to the clouds above, Whitney Houston, and also Azure. It's kind of cool. Why are we here? See, I told you I was going to be loud sound guy. What did I write? To gain an understanding of... Oh, do you know why I don't know these words? Because Carlos wrote them. Why am I here today? To gain an understanding of the different Azure offerings and prepare a readiness checklist. I shortened the words you used because that was the entire write-up for this session. And I summarized them because you said we had a very small screen. And this is tiny. I can barely read it. So how are you going to get there to that whole readiness checklist, understanding of Azure? Well, we're going to speak about the basics of the cloud. I'm going to explain stuff that you already know, some of you, so please don't snore. We're going to go through considerations for migrating and a lot of the stuff that Devin has already covered. Sound guy, Devin's the Microsoft guy who did a whole presentation before this, so that's who I'm referring to. We're going to review data platform offerings. Now, this is an Azure session because Microsoft, right? I'm not going to talk too much about Amazon and Oracle Cloud. Don't laugh. And we're also going to do steps to ensure success. That's going to be one slide, but we're going to speak a lot about it, okay? What is the cloud? What is the cloud? This is an interactive session. The cloud is not somebody else's computer, but what is the cloud? Let's go through this. Anybody? Anybody?
It's an off-prem server.
Off-premises server. It's a very good answer. Anybody else?
Something you don't manage or run an architectural diagram because they didn't want to fill in any of the details and don't care about the details.
People who don't care about the details of where it's running and what it's running on. Correct. That's accurate.
It's also a condensed vapor of cloud, water.
Condensed vapor of water that is in a fluffy formation up in the sky. Good answer, Jonathan.
Something you don't.
You must be an engineer because it's 100% accurate and 0% helpful.
Actually, that makes me a consultant.
Maybe something you don't manage the same way you do when it's on-prem.
Correct. It's an off-prem server that you don't have to worry about managing and stuff. Somebody else's problem. That's true. You'll notice I've got some logos here. You may recognize some of them. Does this actually even work on the screen? It doesn't. My pointer doesn't work. This is green. So on the top left of the images, we have Amazon Web Services. Amazon Web Services was created by accident. They were trying to do something else, and AWS was invented. And AWS is a very good set of services, and they were the de facto web server type thing before Azure came along. This is Google's logo. There wasn't enough room to make it fit nicely if I put Google Compute Platform. So that's why there's no Google here, but that's Google on the top right there. We've got Rackspace. Who uses Rackspace? Good. That was the right answer. Sound guy, nobody said anything. And then Oracle Cloud it's been around for a while, but they really re-announced it this week or last week. Larry Ellison even stood up and said words. Oracle Cloud is going to be what Azure is now in 10 years. I'm not being mean, I'm being honest. So the cloud, to me, because it's my presentation, is a fully redundant infrastructure on fully virtualized environment. What does that mean? Well, Microsoft's in the room, so I'm going to tell you this is a marketing slide. Sorry. Fully redundant under circumstances that may be outside of your control. And fully virtualized, well, yeah, everything's virtualized. You don't know what the hardware layer looks like. So the redundancy side, not guaranteed. So you have to make some changes to your architecture to make it fully redundant. But that's the idea. The very first Azure data center cost $500 million to make. $500 million. 100,000 square feet, that's 10 football fields. I don't know how big a football field is. I was just reading from some documentation. I believe it's that game where you have 5 downs and an out, or an inning. I've never been to one. But there are 10 of them, basically. And in each container, do you know that they use shipping containers for Azure data centers? Each shipping container is 40 feet long, and they can fit 2,500 physical servers inside one shipping container. That is why it cost $500 million for the first one. Does anybody know how many data centers there are now? A lot. Now, this may be difficult to see, but I think it looks pretty. There's a whole bunch in this continent here, US, mainly, America. There's a couple in Canada, which are too far from me, because I'm over here, so I use West US. There's one in Brazil. There's a couple coming to South Africa. There's a whole bunch happening on this side of the world, because that's where most of the people live. And there are some in Australia, too. So when I said that it's fully redundant, I meant that you need to choose your region wisely, because I don't know if you heard, it's a company called Amazon Web Services, run a whole bunch of the internet now. And a whole bunch of lazy programmers put all of their stuff in one region. And then 1/3 of the internet stopped working a few months ago because these people didn't choose their regions wisely. They didn't make use of geo-redundancy. They didn't put their stuff to fail over in different regions anywhere else in the world. So if you're going to put your stuff on this side, make sure there's one on the other side of the country as well. Make sense? And don't put all of your stuff in the same basket. Now we're going to talk about the details of the cloud. And some of you know this, so I apologize in advance. What is infrastructure as a service? Anybody?
VMs.
VMs, correct. Virtual machines as a service. What else? Tough crowd. Storage, I like that one. Yeah, what else? I would consider storage, in some respects, more of a platform as a service, but you can have hard drives that are available to you as virtual devices, yeah? Anyone else?
You have to maintain those servers yourself?
Correct. So that's a very important factor of infrastructure as a service. So virtual machines as a service, all components are virtualized, but you get to manage all those components, so good for you. If the server is slow, you can upgrade it using a couple of clicks of your mouse or PowerShell. Some of you prefer that. Or Azure CLI, which is the command line interface for Azure, which is cross-platform. You can run that on Linux, on a Mac, Windows, or inside the Azure portal itself. So there are lots of ways to manage an infrastructure, but you have to manage it. So that was a very good point, Wes. Thank you. Wes is the guy sitting in the front, sound guy. He has got 4 screens on his desk. It is incredible. Platform as a service, what is that? Sounds good, doesn't it? PaaS. PaaS. You don't have to worry about any management. You just ask for something, it gets spun up, and you use it. So database as a service, we're going to dive deeper into database as a service for this session. I'm going to skip a whole bunch of other stuff that's platform. But database, Azure SQL Database, we've got Cosmos DB, we've got MySQL, we've got Postgres in Azure. Have you ever heard of that stuff before? I know I have. It's my session, right? But the key thing here is it's a minimal administrative overhead. Minimal, not none. Minimal. Again, you get to choose your performance tier, and you can upgrade anytime. Most people are not going to use one or the other. They're going to use a hybrid of the two, right? Or they're going to have a hybrid between IaaS, PaaS, and stuff on premises. So a hybrid solution, and that solution with a small s, and you'll see why coming up, you get to take the best of both worlds and migrate at your own pace. So you may not want to go all in on the cloud. Although Gartner is saying that by 2021, 50% of enterprises are going to be fully in the cloud. So that is the way things are going. You can have an enterprise hybrid solution. Notice the capital letters, because it's expensive. Azure Stack allows you to buy hardware that you put on premises, and you can have your own private cloud, and I'm using air quotes, sound guy. So Azure Stack is the APIs and a lot of the same services that you can get in the cloud, except in this case, it's on premises, and what that allows you to do is develop quickly and deploy test stuff very quickly, and then if it works and you're happy with it, then you can deploy it into the main public cloud. But it's expensive. I mean, we're talking about saving money on standard edition licenses here earlier, so it's not for everybody. But for large corporations who are wasting a lot of time having to spin up instances on the public cloud, this is going to be very useful to them.
What do they deliver? Do they deliver like small containers?
They don't deliver small containers. What you do is they have a specification sheet of what type of hardware you should buy. And there are partners, including HPE and others. I think Dell is one of them as well. And you buy specific hardware, and then you install the Azure Stack on that hardware. One of the limitations with Azure Stack right now, but that will change down the line, is that if you're going to be using Azure DB, for example, you can't spin up you can't do elastic data pools, basically, right now. So if you're planning to use elastic data pools for Azure DB, Azure SQL DB, then you would need to still do that in the main thing, or just find a workaround for that. But that's one of those limitations that are going to go away eventually. Any questions about Stack? I put $4 signs because I don't know if you guys use OpenTable or Yelp. $4 signs means it's going to cost you. It's kind of like paying for Brent Ozar's dinner if you're in Chicago or anything like that. Considerations for migrating to the cloud. Sound guy, there's a lot of laughter right now. Why would you want to move to the cloud?
Everybody's doing it.
Okay. Are you sure you need to move to the cloud? No, seriously, are you sure? Did you hear about it on the golf course?
I read it in CIO magazine. That's right.
Did you read it in Business Insider or CIO magazine?
Actually,
Yeah.
Gartner told me to do it.
Gartner is telling everybody to do it because, they've got to stay in business.
I paid them a lot of money and they told me to do it.
Exactly. And now, speaking of paying a lot of money, thank you, Jonathan, can you afford it? Why do I say that? Because it can get expensive quickly. And that's not anybody's fault. It's just that they don't understand the services that are being provided, so it can get expensive quickly if you don't understand the technology behind it. It's one of my slides.
All those IT guys, I don't have to deal with them anymore.
Jonathan did a fake cough and said, stretch DB. And he is absolutely correct. It is one of the most expensive offerings that are around, but it is useful for some people. And is it right for you? You may be thinking that the boss has said, you need to get to the cloud. Why? What is very cool about the cloud is it's got instant scale up or scale out. Again, star. This is not a marketing slide. This is a factual slide. So there's a star there. It means there will be some downtime. Might be seconds. Might be a couple of seconds. But there is downtime when you're scaling up or scaling out any of the cloud stuff. If you're using IaaS, you're going to need to have the machine shut down, increase the capacity, and then start up again. So that can take up to 3 to 5 minutes. If you're doing Azure SQL DB and you're changing that, it could be 30 seconds, 45 seconds, but there is downtime, so don't think there isn't. The other nice thing about the cloud is that there are low startup costs. Notice the word there is startup. As soon as you start getting bigger, things are going to get expensive fast. So you need to monitor those expenses. But what's cool is that when you're not using it, you don't have to pay for it. Pay per use. Some services charge by the minute, some charge by the hour, and I believe I read last week that some are going to be charged by the second. So you do not have to pay all the time for everything if you're not using it. If you've got servers that are active during business hours, Monday to Friday, shut it down over the weekend. Don't pay for it. And this is the cool thing, Azure is always up to date. If you're using PaaS, Platform as a Service, you never have to worry about this. Sometimes you might have to increase the database compatibility level. If a new version of SQL is released, it'll have an equivalent on Azure, and you may have to increase that yourself manually. But in some cases, they'll do it across the board. If you're doing VMs and you need to get the latest version, let's say, for example, yesterday, maybe the day before yesterday, the bits for SQL Server were released. So you can get a VM template immediately as soon as they're released, and you can plan your migration straight away. You can get the latest versions of software almost immediately. Questions? Carlos, you had your hand?
But I guess I'm curious. I'll turn it into a question. How the pay-per-use really goes. I feel like if you wanted to try something out, let me spin it up, try it. Okay, now I'm done. Right? I feel like that ongoing, for a VM environment, even a development environment, I have developers on it. Like the whole shutting it down over the weekend, I feel like is still a bit of a stretch, just because now you have to have administration around making sure it comes up and down, and then somebody checking it. And I feel like, I don't know, while it might be worth getting that email, hey, I can't get to my development box on Monday, it's still something that I have to now have to think about, right? With the up and down.
So sound guy Carlos raised an excellent point, saying that it increases the administrative overhead to have to shut down and restart VMs, especially in a development context. And that is one of the things with which I agree, because it is extra overhead. However, you can automate that using PowerShell or other methods that at a certain time of day, say 6 a.m. on a Monday morning, if it's a development box, you can get the PowerShell script to start up the VM for you.
So I know at my company, one thing we're doing, we do like large budgets twice a year. When we run these large analytical models on it, we're looking at using it for, rather than having an on-prem machine that's always going to be a certain number of cores. Throughout the year, we only do it twice a year, so throughout the year, we'll crank it down, so it's still there and it's usable. But then during budget season, when they're running 150, 200 models across like a real estate company, so thousands and thousands of properties, and we're doing 30-year cash flows and these huge models, we'll crank it up, because at that point, like, our cost to run it at a huge capacity for 2 days or something, then we crank it back down. So
I mean, that's the classic scenario. That is the classic cloud scenario. Right?
So Aaron raised the point that they have VMs that they crank up, they can scale up for very busy parts of the season, and they can also scale down when they're done. That is one of the attractions of the cloud, yeah. And in fact, that is one of the major reasons why it's very attractive. And you can do that on premises with VMs and stuff like that. But with Azure, the pricing model makes sense for that kind of stuff. One of the other considerations for the cloud is that you have this amazing thing called the Azure Marketplace. So if you want to try out the new Oracle 18C, I don't know if 18C is out yet, but you could. And then you change your mind, shut it down, and go to Azure SQL DB because it's better. That was phrased as a question, sound guy. I'm not actually making a statement about the good or bad merits of Oracle. I think it's just fine technology if you're running PeopleSoft. I used to work with PeopleSoft. Those were good times. Any questions about the marketplace?
Oh, no, not the market.
Oh, go ahead anyway, Wes.
Okay. 2 questions.
Yes.
Before coming here, I told my boss I was going to be coming here, and the questions he had was, you talked about hybrid, and you explained, about having the the cloud computers, the Azure cloud computers on site, right? But when he's thinking of hybrid, he's thinking he's going to need the IaaS and the PaaS together, because what he can't figure out is how to run our SSRS, because he wants to go with the platform, the PaaS, but he doesn't see how we can do SSRS on that. And so we know there's the BI, but I have friends who have looked into it, and they say that you can't pass parameters into the BI. So we do a whole lot of reporting, right? Databases really are not useful without reporting. So we have a huge team of reporting people. And so what do? Do you truly have to go kind of hybrid PaaS and IaaS to handle that? Right?
Wes's question was, do you have to choose between the two, or can you use a hybrid between IaaS and PaaS? And the answer is yes, because you must use whatever suits you. And what Microsoft and the other cloud providers are giving you is that opportunity to choose and do a mix and match, whatever suits you. So by all means, do that, because Azure is changing every day. There may be a new product that comes out next week that can solve all your problems for you. But in the meantime, you have to make your decisions now. Mix and match. That's what is going to happen. And what you'll find, especially with problems with SOX compliance, as was mentioned earlier today, is a lot of your stuff has to stay on site. And then you might have to change it, modify it somehow, go and use the Azure services to do whatever they do and then bring it back. And then you would use something like an express route VPN, which doesn't even go over the public internet, to bypass all of their compliance issues. Use whatever you need to use in Azure and then bring it back again. So by all means, mix and match. Any other questions? Moving on. Are you moving to SQL Server on a VM? I worked on a project last year with Steve Stedman, who is Carlos's business partner, moving a 50 database network to Azure SQL VMs. So we didn't change the infrastructure at all. We just basically moved all the databases from on-premises SQL servers to SQL Server VMs in Azure. And the price was halved, so they paid 50% less than what they were paying, and the performance doubled. All they did was move from a data center somewhere in the US to Azure. That's the only change that was made. And
So they had a private cloud.
kind of. It's basically co-location. So they had a VPN to their co-location environment.
The tricky part for us is we have local VMs, so they're sort of kind of free. And it's, how do you gain the trust, or how do you convince upper management that this added cost is worth the money?
How do you convince upper management that the added cost is worth the money? What added cost are you referring to?
The monthly bill from Azure.
Right, but what is that made up of? That monthly bill that you pay Microsoft every month for your VMs comprises the VM itself, the SQL Server license, and the Windows license. So that's 3 things that you're dealing with there. So how much is the Windows license a part of that? And how much is the SQL Server license a part of that? And are you able to, with your software assurance agreement, use those licenses that you've already paid for your VMs in the cloud? Can you do that?
We have software assurance.
If you have software assurance, then you should be able to use those same licenses. Obviously, your VMs will no longer be on-premises, they'll be in the cloud, but you can migrate those licenses across. Does the same apply to Windows?
I think it does, but I've checked.
Check with your Microsoft licensing partner, whoever it is. because you could also run on Linux. Did you know that SQL Server 2017 now runs on Linux? It's very smart technology. It's very clever people who did that. But maybe that's something to consider. Maybe the cost is not as bad as you think it is. And maybe some of the workloads that you're dealing with can be divided up into smaller VMs that don't cost as much. Because the whole thing about the cloud is it's changing how you do stuff. The reason most people go to SQL Server on a VM is because it's what they know. But there may be a case where some of your applications and your environment, your systems, can be migrated to platform as a service and just using the greater Azure framework to do that on. But it does require some rethinking and, of course, cost associated with changing the applications as well.
In my company, we had kind of free VMs until we had to do a hardware refresh. And then they suddenly realized...
That's a very good point Aaron raised, is that you have to pay for the new hardware when something fails. And that problem goes away with this. And if you've designed your environment correctly on Azure, you will never even know that something failed.
So, I don't know. I mean, we use that in like a business case at least.
Yeah. No,
We kind of took what our hardware refresh would be, kind of did it to a monthly cost over like a 3-year refresh.
That's exactly how I buy my laptops. Is this Mac cost $4,000, let's say, but I'm paying it off over 4 years, so it's like $3 a day. It's peanuts. And your hardware refresh could come every 5 years or it could come every 8 years. And if it's every 8 years, then it's going to be even more expensive because RAM just recently went up. Did you know that? Memory prices have increased again. So now I put here there's no limitations to SQL Server on a VM. Obviously there are limitations, but they aren't the same as the limitations you experience on Azure SQL DB. So I'm not going to put a star next to no limitations there because you know what I mean. And you've got access to the latest software. So if you need to go from SQL Server 2014 to 2017, you can do that quite easily. Obviously, your databases have to be compatible, but you can also run in a lower compatibility level, but you get all the extra stuff. So you get the better optimizer, you get the better everything. And it could be faster than what you're experiencing currently on premises. Same development paradigm. Nothing changes on your application. You just change the endpoints of your connection strings. Everything works. Are you moving to Azure SQL Database? There are some big differences between Azure SQL Database and SQL Server. The main attraction for Azure's SQL Database, the main attraction here is multi-tenant. So if you've got an application that belongs to a bunch of different customers, you can spin them each up on their own database. You don't have to have everything in one place. And you can charge accordingly. You can also run these guys in their own elastic database pools, which keeps your costs consistent so that you don't get a surprise at the end of the month. How many of you have used elastic database pools? Show of hands. 2 people. They both happen to be speakers, so they probably did it for demos. Yep. The premise behind elastic database pools is that you get to put a whole bunch of databases and then they have different usages. So some time of the day, that database is going to be busy, the other ones are going to be quiet. But overall, it averages out, so you pay less per month instead of getting a surprise at the end of the month. Multi-tenant approach, does that concept make sense to you, or do I need to explain that? We good? Good. Who here has heard of the saying, may you live in interesting times? That's what I mean by interesting. May you live in interesting times is a curse. It's an ancient Chinese curse, I believe. There are some interesting limitations to Azure SQL Database. Some of them are bypassed by using elastic database pools, but others you can't get around. Microsoft will be releasing a new service called Managed Instances sometime soon. I'm on the MVP mailing list. They don't even know when. See, I didn't tell you what they did say. I told you what they didn't say. because of NDA reasons. Sound guy, edit that out. The main problem is that you cannot do stuff like schedule tasks, like you can with the agent, which is really neat because some of us have scheduled tasks that we run all the time. You can't do, well, you can, but it's very limited, cross-database queries. So if you have a system that relies on a whole bunch of databases together, it's tricky. There are size limits. They've just bumped up the limit to 4 terabytes for databases, but some of you might have bigger databases than that. Recently, it was still 1 terabyte, and you were paying a lot of money for that 1 terabyte. On the other hand, the DTU, which is how Microsoft measures usage of the Azure SQL database, if you understand how it works, then you can embrace the technology and design your systems around it. Who here doesn't know what a DTU is? Enough people for me to explain it. Nobody outside of Microsoft knows. It is a, well, I don't work for Microsoft, so I'm going to guess as well. It is a magic number that involves log flushes per second, memory, and CPU. Those 3. And what you can do is you can open up Performance Monitor on your SQL Server instance, and you can measure those 3, could be 4, but those 3 are involved. Those 3 measurements for about an hour during a busy time, because don't do it during quiet time, because otherwise it's pointless. You do it during a busy time, so when you scale up your VM to that busy time of the month, or you can also scale whatever, and you measure these 3 or 4 performance metrics for an hour, and then you take that CSV file that is created, and you put it into a third-party thing called the DTU Calculator. It stands for Database Transaction Unit. And I'll show you the calculator if we've got time, and if you care enough. Happy to. I've got it open already. And it is a Azure website that you just plug the CSV into. You tell the calculator how many CPU cores are allocated to that instance as well, so that it can help you with the calculation. And then it tells you what size, what performance tier of Azure SQL database you should use. And you may get a surprise, just like some of us at the restaurant last night were surprised by the meals we got. Because you go to Guy Fieri's Smoking Steakhouse, whatever it's called, and you expect monster food. I was pleasantly surprised by my meal. Firstly, it wasn't massive, and it was quite tasty. So I can now say that Guy Fieri's food isn't that bad. On the other hand, Jonathan got the biggest plate of, I don't even know what you ordered, nachos as a appetizer, and it was bigger than his head. And I'm not even exaggerating, I took pictures. You do not want the nacho surprise with your DTU calculator, because it's better to know beforehand that it's going to cost you 240,000 Canadian dollars a year. Sorry, I only work in Canadian. For a P15 instance, or should I say an Azure SQL database, when you should change the way you do things and only use, say, a P2 or a P3, which costs a lot less than that. So the DTU calculator, which is free to use, will help you with that surprise. And it may work out cheaper for you by a long shot to get a VM instead for $3,000 a month instead of 20,000, right? So DTU is how they measure stuff on Azure SQL Database, they being Microsoft. Shout out to Microsoft in the room. And instead of getting a surprise, you will know exactly what you will be expecting to pay and plan accordingly. By that I mean, create new applications. It is a completely new development paradigm. I love the word paradigm. Paradigm. Way of thinking. A lot of us have been developing code the same way since the 1990s. We open up our IDE and we drag and drop, and some of us do it from the command line, but it amounts to the same thing. Here you're going to have to think about things differently because Azure is a whole lot bigger than just the way we've been doing things before. We'll get into that a little bit. Any questions about these two slides? Good. I was a school teacher. I can hear when people are talking in my room. The whispered chats. I can also read lips. Randolph is amazing.
That's right.
And humble. So, moving on, what I see when people create their hybrid solutions is that they start with Azure Storage because it is the easiest way to get into Azure. And then it's very attractive. It's actually quite cheap. If you need to store stuff anywhere, I highly recommend Azure Storage. The blob storage, cool storage, which doesn't require a lot of reads and writes, is very, very respectably priced. It competes admirably, because they had to, with Amazon S3. I don't know what the three S's stand for, but Amazon has a service offering called S3, which costs X number of cents per gigabyte. I think it's 3 or 30 cents. 3.
1.3 cents. It's a simple storage service.
Simple storage service, thank you. And their pricing and Microsoft's pricing for cool storage are almost identical. Warm storage is obviously more expensive, but then you pay for it up front with the storage costs, and you don't have to pay as much for your transfer costs. Then you have something called something. I forget now. I'm talking about the third storage offering, which competes with Glacier, the Microsoft one. It's very, very cheap. It's incredibly cheap, but you pay for ingress, you pay for everything. But it is hardened storage that can store your stuff for up to 10 years if you want to. The point is that Microsoft and Amazon have got competing products, and you can pick and choose between them. But if everything's already in Azure, this is usually people's point of entry. It's like getting hooked on drugs. It starts with Azure Storage. So, this slide has a star in it because, hey, it's the cloud. You need an internet connection, whatever you want, whenever you need it, and it's all subscription-based. Anybody old enough, haha, to remember mainframes? Heard of them. I've worked on. There's people in the room still working on them. Mainframe is a big computer, somebody else's computer that you're renting time on. So is Azure. It's the same thing. So what we've done is we've gone through that whole cycle of desktop computers, and they're boring, so we're doing something else now. I said I'd cover some of this now. The different stuff that Azure offers, because we've spoken mostly about Azure SQL Database. Let's talk about the other stuff. Virtual machines. We know what those are. In fact, 90%, last time I checked, of all SQL Server instances all over the world are virtualized, which means that there's a lot of wasted licenses out there, folks. So one of the consolidation things you can think about is license consolidation. If you're already virtualizing, maybe it might be cheaper to get an enterprise license. Just saying. So virtual machines, spoken about. App service, what's app service? Anybody here a developer? One person. Well, make it kind of. I'm kind of a developer. You're kind of. I can guarantee half of you write code without even wanting to. App service is the web application service that Azure offers. It was one of the first offerings that they had. So you write your web application, and point it at an Azure SQL database, and there's your stuff. All serverless. Don't you hate that term? I know I do. Functions and logic apps to non-developers are practically the same thing. They're just chunks of code that do stuff, but you don't need to spin up a VM with IIS to run that code. It's already there. Containers, we've touched on briefly already. We've got Docker and Docker. That was intentional. We've got batch processes. So one of the big problems that I had originally with Windows Server 2016, I found this major bug in the task scheduler, that if you scheduled the task previous to 2016 in the past and set it to repeat, it would repeat. So let's say I wanted to start at 7 a.m. every morning. I would set it to today, 7 a.m., and then set it to repeat, and it would work. 2016, it doesn't do that. It has to be set into the future if you want a repeating task. Surprise. I mean, it's just a usability thing. It's not a bug. It's just, it was changed. Why is that relevant? Because my batch processes that relied on that task scheduler didn't work. Azure's got this very cool batch feature, which I use to run Slack. I don't use it to run Slack. I use it to write to Slack. Every 15 minutes, I have a function that queries a SQL database somewhere in the world and then writes something to a Slack channel so I can get notified about how much money I'm making. Doesn't run every 15 minutes, unfortunately. But that's a batch process that...
Be a record returned for it to write.
Correct. Well, what it is there is the task scheduler on steroids. You can make it do anything. It's kind of like your SQL agent as well. So your batch stuff here, thinking outside of the box, is one of the workarounds for the SQL agent missing in Azure SQL Database, right? All of these things sit on top of the service fabric. But what Microsoft has done is they've exposed the service fabric to you as well. So the stuff that Cosmos is offering now is what Azure SQL Database and VMs and all that stuff runs on already. They've just exposed that to you as well. So whereas Amazon and Google and all that stuff gives you certain services, Microsoft's giving you one level down. And that includes cloud services as well. So you can write your microservices using the same architecture that Azure itself is running on, which means it's fast and it's tested code. So it's fairly reliable. Any questions about compute? Good. How many of you here know about networking? Randolph had a heavy lesson this morning in getting his networking stuff to work. For a demo he may not even have time to do. Anybody? Network experts? Fantastic. I'll skip the slide. The important thing at the bottom here is DDoS protection is built in for free on your Azure virtual network. If you want more targeted protection, like your site is being attacked, then you can pay a little bit extra. But I really like this stuff because it does it for you out of the box. ExpressRoute I also mentioned. That means you can have a VPN connection from your premises to the cloud without going over the public internet. It's more secure and it's a little bit faster. Storage, touched on briefly, but there is a lot going on under the covers as well. Blob storage, which is where you just store files. Queue storage. How many of you have used a message queue before? This is for storing that so that it can be processed. First in, first out. Databases. That's why we're here, right? How many of you have used MySQL, MySQL? How many of you have used Postgres? How many of you have used SQL Database? Data warehouse? For demos or for real life?
Demos.
Real life. So that's one. I'm impressed. You're the first.
There was a migration from
Migration from PDW. How did it go?
actually went well.
Good.
And they realized they could use standard SQL.
Oh. So it got expensive fast and they changed their mind? Yeah. Cosmos DB we've spoken about before. You'll see at the bottom there, table storage. Table storage stands on its own and it's also part of Cosmos DB. So that's pretty neat. Table storage is spinning disks. Cosmos DB is a layer on top of that. That makes it 99.99. That's 4 nines of availability across the entire planet. How many of you have used SSIS for data warehouse loading and stuff like that? Have you ever used Data Factory?
Yeah.
And?
I hate it.
You hate it because?
Because it's not SSIS. It's not SSIS.
Because it's not SSIS.
It's a legit import export tool. That's it.
Legit is, I'm going to put some scare quotes around that.
I'll give you that.
Now, each of these should have its own slide, but I don't want to bore you any further than I have to. But there is a whole lot going on in Azure that you don't know about, that I don't know about. Data and analytics. Have you ever heard or used streaming data analytics? For everybody else, imagine you have a whole bunch of IoT devices that are writing to a queue somewhere. You can process that while it's streaming to you without having to store the data anywhere. Pretty cool. And then you can go and run Cortana on there, AI and cognitive services. Internet of Things spoken about. Enterprise integration is for all the companies that still have stuff on premises that they need to integrate to. Anybody used Azure AD? Anybody used Office 365? Nobody here is a developer, so I'll skip VSTS. Monitoring and management tools. Tracy's going to give us a whole bunch of stuff there as well. But it's all there. And so finally, I get to my slide that says, how do you prepare for the cloud? I told you it was one slide. Identify databases for migration. Figure out which ones that you want to migrate. Check the compatibility with the data migration assistant. Version 3.3 was released this week, in fact, yesterday. So you will now be able to migrate to Azure SQL Database from SQL 2017 if you want to. Use the DTU Calculator, which I mentioned. And test, test, test. Kind of obvious me saying test, but some people, I don't always test my code, but when I do, it's in production. Please don't do that. How many of you have never used Azure before? Well, have I got news for you? Use it for free.
If it was free, you wouldn't need my credit card.
It's their billing system that's janky. There's a conversation happening, but they do need the card for the system. It will not be charged.
Potential that you'll actually like it and want to do more.
Well, there's limits too with the free, and then
It works as follows. It's like I was prepared or something. $200 of credit for the first 30 days. $200 does go quite a long way if you watch your usage, your resources, and stuff like that. Don't forget to turn off your VMs. Exactly. Don't use HD Insight. Don't use Stretch Database. You'll notice I skipped Stretch Database. I didn't even mention it. It's on the slide, but I didn't even mention it. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that is available for free anyway, which they're giving you for free as well. Huh. Edit that ha out. Well, do we have time for demos, Carlos?
We have time for let's do the nickel tour.
The nickel, not even the dime tour.
We can maybe the
It's
other
almost
time.
like the nickel back tool.
Look at this photograph. Well, take a picture of this if you want to contact me in the future. If you don't. I don't care. I'm writing a book. The names of the authors on that book have changed yet again, so don't write those down. And as I mentioned, I was on Fargo Season 3, Episode 9, where I was dead. So, demo. How many of you have used SQL Server 2017? Me. Sound guy, that noise was Microsoft guy leaving the room. Let's talk some dirt about Microsoft. I mentioned the DTU Calculator. So the DTU Calculator uses processor total, processor time, logical disk reads per second, logical disk writes per second, and log bytes flushed. It needs all of those things to give you a good or bad answer about what kind of service and performance tier that you need for your Azure SQL database. I ran this file through something, and I was expecting standard, S3, because standard is fairly inexpensive for the type of workload we're using for this customer. Unfortunately, it said that 4% of that hour, so I ran this over a busy time, 4% needed a premium P1. Now we're already starting to get into the expensive stuff. And then it said, hey, 20% is premium P2. Premium P2, unsurprisingly, is double the price of P1. And then for 8% of the time, it's getting into P4. Okay? P4 is expensive too. It was cheaper for these guys to go to a VM based purely on these numbers for 1 hour of capturing. And that saved them, well, it's the difference between $900 and $2,000 a month. So
The VM's using SSDs now.
the VM is using an SSD, and it's still cheaper. Now, the VM's using SSDs, that's only $300 a month, roughly, for a P30 1 terabyte drive. It's not that expensive.
The trade-off, though, is that you have to manage it as
Correct. And with managed, you can have managed disks as well, which cost a little bit more, but then you never have to worry about redundancy because it's taken care of for you. So that becomes an expense that can be written off differently. So the Azure SQL Database DTU Calculator is extremely useful if you're planning to go to the cloud. Please make use of this. Please measure the stuff while it is a busy process, obviously. That's the one part of the nickel tour. What else do I have to show you?
So that's if you're going with PAAS.
Pass,
If you're doing the
correct.
IAAS, you don't need to do
But what this does tell you is whether it's a good idea to go to pass in the first place because it might be too expensive.
Okay.
Because the example I gave earlier, a P15 is 6 times the price of a very good VM. What's the point?
How did you know what size VM to get?
The size of the VM compares to the one that you have currently, let's say. So you can get, and they're all multiples of 7 gigabytes of RAM for some reason, but you can get one with, say, 56 gigs of RAM and 4 CPU cores, whatever, and then the hard drives. So you can pick and choose according to that. And if it's too big, then you can scale down, or you can scale up. Yes,
With
Wes.
the IAAS, do you still have to pay input-output?
Yes,
Okay.
unless your application. So the question was, do you still have to pay for ingress charges? Yes, you do, unless your application is in the same region. So you can set up all of your stuff in, say, West US 2 or East US 2, depending on where you are. And if your application server is in the same region as your SQL Server instance, then you don't have to pay any charges because it's all in the same Azure region. As soon as it leaves Azure, whether it's going to on-site or public internet, then you do have to pay the charges there.
Okay.
It's a good question. Any other questions?
This
Because
isn't a tool that's from Azure, is that correct? Or
it is a third-party tour, but somebody from Microsoft wrote it because nobody outside of Microsoft knows exactly the formula.
and if they change the formula, we're assuming hopefully that would be upgraded as well.
This has been written by a Microsoft employee. So although it is third-party, it's not a Microsoft product. It is written by one of the team members. So the idea is that if the formula changes, which it's unlikely to, things are just going to get faster. Then you would come in here. So this is what it looks like on the front. You can choose whether you want a single database or if you want Elastic. And these are the measures. There's even a script here to download the command line utility. Let's see if this works. Oh, it didn't work. Okay. Download command line utility or a PowerShell script. And as soon as you execute it, it runs on the command line, captures it for an hour, send that file off to here, upload the file, tell it how many cores you have, and it'll spit out the details. And here's a recommendation. It says Premium P2, and that was too expensive for this customer. These are actual numbers. I was going to show you an actual live migration to the cloud, but we don't have time for that. It can take up to...
I think we should. We'll circle back.
We can circle back.
So again, we have some flexibility tomorrow. If it's something that we still want to do, and, even if it's a one-off, looking at the list. It's not one of the things that came up, but we can.
Yeah. Any other questions, or am I wrapping up?